From butterflies in your stomach to legs that feel like overcooked pasta, anxiety is one emotion where we easily make the mind and body connection. Learn more about anxiety and treatment for anxiety disorders. That's next on Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. Tonight we're talking about anxiety and anxiety disorders, but fear not. Take a deep breath in, open your ears wide, and prepare to learn what you need to do to master your anxiety. Anxiety and anxiety disorders are among the most treatable mental health problems, but mastery requires diligent work and a bit of courage. Tonight, I'm joined by expert guests and, of course, you. So call the numbers on your screen right now. With your questions, locally dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. And you can also email them using the address listed at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering your questions throughout the show. Joining me now is Dr. Dan D'Allard, a licensed clinical psychologist with the Duluth Psychological Clinic, who conducts psychological evaluations and provides therapy to both adults and children. And Heather Boehm is a psychotherapist with the Human Development Center, who treats adults with a variety of mental health problems, including anxiety and anxiety disorders. Thanks to both of you for coming here tonight. So Dan, somebody asked me in the office today, a client said, so what's the show on? And I said, well, the show's on anxiety. Oh, so are you going to be talking about stress? So what is that kind of relation between stress and anxiety?
Absolutely. So anxiety, as you said in your introduction, is primarily emotion, but it has several different facets to it. And stress is one of the things in our environment that can prompt anxiety, right? So stress is something that makes a demand on us. And in that interval between when the demand is made and when we know we can meet the demand, anxiety pops in and sort of alerts us and says, hey, there's something in the environment that needs attending to. Attend to it, do something effective about it.
And so stress is not always a bad thing, and it's often a motivating factor for us, and also can heighten our attention and the alertness that we can bring to something to actually perform at our best even.
That's absolutely right. We tend to use stress almost exclusively pejoratively, but in fact stress orients us to something that needs attention. And we are wired as human animals for anxiety for just that reason. Anxiety primes us to do something effective about something in the environment.
And Heather, let's talk a little bit about the function of anxiety. So there are certain situations in life where actually we ought to be afraid, right? And so tell us a little bit about how anxiety helps us in those situations then, or can help us.
Well, I would speak to, I guess, my experience in working with veterans, of course, and when they're overseas and they're in a combat situation, the anxiety for them is a way in which they're able to remain sort of safe, right? When they come back stateside and they're going to the grocery store, some of those same kinds of thoughts may pop up for them, such as, you know, I'm in danger, or this is not a safe place. Those things may still come up for them, but it's not, and they may still have some of those same kinds of emotional responses, but they're not necessarily in danger at that time.
And the anxiety experience that we have, that flooding of the adrenaline that prepares us either to fight or to flee. And if you're in a burning house, being prepared to flee is actually a good thing then.
Hugely adaptive. We're built to experience anxiety because it's adaptive to have anxiety. It orients us to do something. In a burning house, in a combat situation, crossing a busy street, we ought to be extra alert. And our body gives us the chemicals and the readiness to respond quickly that we need to act quickly and stay safe. So it's absolutely a useful thing for us. It just crosses over into not helpful when the alerting system is overgeneralized or we get too anxious and we can't act productively.
And so let's talk about that then. When anxiety goes from the normal anxiety to the debilitating anxiety, and what the symptoms are that people have then when they're experiencing debilitating anxiety, for example, Heather.
That would be sort of excessive, worrying about something in particular, or, the idea that that something may happen that's pretty unrealistic, like such as, like the likelihood that if
well, the likelihood that the bridge will fall down when I drive across it. So that's a good example, because we have two big bridges here that we're often driving across, and for most of the time those bridges are they're fine. But we also know about the bridge collapse that happened down in the cities, and some people have reacted to that then to even though they weren't even near that event,
That's right.
in a way to suggest that they are now themselves at greater risk for driving across a bridge and having that bridge collapse. So that having irrational fear about a situation that is mostly safe for us.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
There are a number of anxiety disorders. Let's start talking
Yeah.
about them, because there are so many. And I want to start first, Dan, because you work with children too. And children not only can become anxious, but they can develop anxiety disorders
Absolutely.
as well.
Sure. Two of the more common anxiety disorders in kids are separation anxiety and generalized anxiety disorder. As Heather said, generalized anxiety disorder has to do with excessive worrying and catastrophizing about things, and not marshaling your coping resources in a way that you can respond adaptively to it. So the worrying is out of proportion to the actual fear. Separation anxiety happens for kids when they have trouble separating from their primary caretakers, and it's awfully anxiety provoking to be out in the world or even alone in your own house without the security of parents close by. So those are the two I see most often. They're very treatable, they're not that uncommon. We know what to do about them in our offices.
And I often describe generalized anxiety disorder as you mentioned, as the worry wart on steroids, right?
Yeah, you're right.
That they worry about everything and can't distinguish between the things that a person ought to worry about versus the things that don't need any worry at all.
That's right.
Here's a question from a woman, Heather. Is anxiety caused by a traumatic life event? And I think she's asking, can you experience anxiety in response to a traumatic life event?
I would say yes, but not always. I mean, I think people sometimes can suffer from anxiety and not, necessarily have a trauma history. But definitely, I think when people do have histories of sort of a trauma event, it sort of changes their belief system some, and how they kind of see the world and see themselves and other people, and may trigger some of those kinds of anxiety-provoking thoughts, like the world is unsafe, or if I trust, I might get hurt, or something along those lines.
And actually, when we think about anxiety disorders, it's all about, a lot of that is about the perception of danger, right? Mm-hmm. And assigning that there is the feeling that there is too much danger, when in reality, that's what we would call sort of the irrational assignment of too much danger to what the real situation is.
That's right.
So people who are afraid to ride the elevator, and if you're not afraid to ride the elevator, you're kind of rolling your eyes, going like it's really safe to ride the elevator, but that only 1 in a million might crash. But the person who's afraid of riding the elevators will focus in on the 1 in a million.
That's right. That example you just gave points to the importance in therapy of looking at how people think about anxiety-provoking situations, because it's easy to exaggerate the actual risk one faces. That's a very good example in the elevator. Most of us will have no problems ever in elevators in our lifetime, but they still provoke a little bit of anxiety because it could happen. And if you can tame your thinking around the likelihood of it happening, you got a better chance of coping well with your anxiety.
And talk a little bit about some of those containment strategies, Heather, that we might teach somebody to help them with their thinking so that they can manage the feelings that are associated with that then?
So I tend to come from a cognitive behavioral therapy approach. So, we tend to look at, we do something called like a threat forecast, right? So if the threat is the elevator, falling or the bridge collapsing, kind of looking at that and looking at, well, what is the evidence really to suggest that that potentially might happen? And what's the evidence sort of against that? And kind of starting to look at that and try to look at that in sort of an objective way. And then in addition to that, looking at, what are some behavioral interventions, some things to kind of help so that the person feels a little bit more in control of the physiological parts of anxiety, which can oftentimes, lead people feeling very panicky and that. So looking at deep breathing, looking at guided imagery, looking at trying to keep the threshold of the anxiety managed and down so that when they get in those situations, they're not so easily provoked.
Let's talk a little bit about panic attacks, because a lot of people have had panic attacks. They don't necessarily have panic disorder, but a lot of people have had panic attacks. Tell us what the symptoms of a panic attack are.
Well, the symptoms are everything that we've been talking about accelerated immensely. So your body reacts, your heart starts pounding often, your palms get sweaty, you start trembling and shaking, your chest can get awfully tight. The catastrophic thoughts are extreme, even to the point of thinking I might die. And there's not a realistic element to that, but it's understandable because some of the symptoms mimic what people experience in a heart attack. The fear is incredibly intense. It's an overwhelming experience when people, especially when they first encounter it.
And I always say, if I'm asking a client, have you ever had a panic attack? And they say, well, what's that? And I said, oh, if you have to ask, you haven't had it.
That's exactly right.
Because everybody knows what that is. And I think physically, that is such an uncomfortable feeling that you can see how people then subsequently get into avoidance patterns of, I will do anything to avoid that feeling again. And talk a little bit, Heather, about the role that avoidance often plays with people in who develop anxiety disorders.
Avoidance is like throwing gasoline on a fire, I would say. Like, it tends to sort of fuel the symptoms, so people will continue to avoid and perpetuate sort of that cycle. And so when we're looking at treatment, that's oftentimes what we're going to be talking with a person about, is helping them address some of that avoidance. And so that can look like a couple different kinds of things, where we're looking at maybe some type of hierarchy where we kind of start very small steps towards helping them reach that goal of being able to ride up and down the elevator and not suffering a panic attack, or being able to get on the airplane and not being terrified and completely uncomfortable. So there's little things that we can kind of do along the way to sort of help combat some of that.
And I think that's one of the cruel things about anxiety disorders that, Heather, you described. The avoidance behavior is the one thing you can do to make your anxiety worse is to do the one thing that you want to do most of all, right? Because what you want to do is like, please don't put me in that situation where I might have that same panic attack again. And that's what you were talking about, perpetuates the anxiety then.
And it's a bit counterintuitive to encourage people to approach something that makes them frightened. But what we do in therapy is we have them do it, and we pair that with recommendations and guidance about how to reduce the physiological arousal, okay? So as we send the person to the elevator that they fear, we're coaching them on relaxation techniques and different ways to think so that their mind and their body are calmer, and they develop confidence as they observe themselves responding differently than they have in the past. So we don't send people into the situations unarmed. We give them new tools so that they have a different experience.
Right. We're not pushing you off the diving board without first teaching you how to swim and tread water, giving you some water wings when you're on the diving board. So deep breathing, that is something I like to teach a lot of clients because even if they don't have a primary anxiety disorder, anxiety is often, we know, accompanies many other mental health problems as well. But Heather, sometimes, I'll have clients say to me like, well, that deep breathing doesn't work for me. And so I'm sure you've probably heard the same thing. And so what do you say to that person who insists that deep breathing is an ineffective treatment strategy?
Well, probably that they're not doing it properly, right? And so we will kind of take some time in session and see exactly how they are doing their breathing. People who have anxiety tend to be chest breathers, and they're not really doing good, belly breaths. And when you watch a baby sleep, you can see the belly going up and down, right? And so kind of helping reteach the person how to breathe would be kind of one of the first steps in that, I think.
And if that doesn't work, I would talk to the person about the fact that regulating your breathing is a means to an end. The end is regulate your physiological processes when you're anxious. If breathing doesn't work well for you, there's other things that we can do. There's mental imagery and other sorts of tasks. So we don't want to press hard on something that doesn't work for that person, but we do want to explore what's in the way of you doing this as well as you can.
And I think too that people, deep breathing sounds like something you should just be able to do and be good at it right away. And so what I also talk with people about is really that is a skill, and it is a skill to it's a skill to do. It's also a skill to remember to do it when you need to do it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what I find often is that when people say it doesn't work, it's that, well, it's not that it doesn't work, it's that you're not using it when you could be using it, or you're not catching the anxiety on the way up. You're hitting at a 10. And when you can only get your anxiety, when deep breathing only takes it down to a 9, you're saying to yourself, well, that isn't good enough. That's not what I had in mind.
Heather talked earlier about making hierarchies of alarming situations. And one reason we do that is to deepen the person's awareness of what actually is provoking the anxiety. Sometimes we misunderstand our own anxiety. And therapy can be helpful to really pinpoint what is it about these situations that prompts it. That helps people recognize it sooner and know when to reach for the relaxation techniques or the cognitive restructuring techniques.
And so in building a hierarchy, let's go back to that elevator example. How would you help somebody sort of build this hierarchy of things we're going to expose you to, so that we expose you to the thing that maybe you're afraid to ride the elevator up to the 100th floor. And so how would you begin to construct a hierarchy with someone?
We would sort of look at, for them, maybe just starting with walking up to the elevator with someone that they're a loved one or somebody that they're close with, or maybe if walking up to the elevator with me during a session, right? And starting, that might be kind of lower down on the hierarchy. And then maybe higher up on the hierarchy would be being able to go in and ride up to the first floor or something like that, right? And then slowly building on that. There's the hierarchy, and then I know sometimes we'll do something called flooding as well, where it's sort of like hopping on the elevator and riding up to the 10th floor, but we do that, try to do that during a session so that there's kind of somebody there to kind of coach the client along. So does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. And so in flooding, which is kind of like, that's not the hierarchy is the baby stepping, and the flooding is jumping off the high dive.
There you go. My favorite metaphors are nibbling is the hierarchy and swallowing it whole is the flooding.
Oh, okay.
And sometimes choose your metaphor, but and the principle behind flooding is you take the plunge right away and have an aha discovery of, my God, I did it. And just the knowledge of I did it once and survived it can be transformative, literally, for people.
And we also, another part of that flooding or exposure experience is that we have that person ride that elevator until they can feel their anxiety go down, because what we know is that you can't hold your breath forever, right? And that your body will not sustain that high level of anxiety for forever. We just need to keep you on the elevator to see that that's true, and that's how that whole transformation starts then. Agoraphobia, let's talk about that.
So agoraphobia sometimes accompanies significant anxiety, and agoraphobia literally it means fear of the marketplace, but generally what it means is a fear to go out of one's comfort zone, which is usually home. So agoraphobia is essentially about being homebound or really restricted from leaving home, except with intense anxiety or with a lot of reassurance from other people. It can be quite disabling. Imagine you struggle to get out of your house to go to your job or go to school or go buy groceries or what have you. So it's a little bit, I think of it as an extension of separation anxiety. The child who fears leaving his or her parent can become the adult who fears leaving the home base of home or other safe places because the anxiety is too frightening when I get out there.
And what role do friends and family maybe play in helping people? Because I know sometimes, especially with agoraphobia, people will say, well, I can't go anywhere unless I have somebody with me. Good thing or not good thing, Heather?
I think it certainly can be a good thing, but at some point in time, depending on where the family member is at, right? Like I think at some point in time, if they're wanting to be able to move past where they can go to the grocery store by themselves, or they can just walk down the block by themselves, you know, using that family member as a support person, you know, may be helpful. You know, if someone comes in with a family member and you know, we could look at that hierarchy, right, where the family member meets them 2 blocks down and the person walks to meet that person, where we can slowly help get them out of the house with the help of their family member. So I don't know if there's necessarily a good or bad.
So I like what you're saying, because you're talking about that that in this situation that people often do use buddies. People with agoraphobia often use buddies to help them. Like I'll send my spouse to the grocery store for me rather than myself going to the grocery store, or I can go to the grocery store as long as I have my spouse with me, and there can almost become kind of an enabling component. But with good treatment, you can take that spouse who's been willing to do all of those things and become a helper in terms of helping them to get better then.
It's often an element of treatment of agoraphobia. Let's start with the reassurance being actively present for you all the time as you do the feared thing. And then let's slowly withdraw that external reassurance and you internalize it. So you are doing self-reassurance as you go through this. And suddenly you're able to go to the grocery store on your own because you're doing adaptive self-talk rather than the catastrophizing self-talk.
At what point does a person know that they need help, Heather?
When it's starting to affect relationships, I would say, when it's starting to affect work, when it's starting to, you know, maybe they're starting to pull back on things that they once really enjoyed and really cared about doing. You know, when their life is really being affected by the anxiety. They're not sleeping, they're not able to concentrate, you know, they don't have a lot of energy, they're irritable. You know, when all of that kind of starts affecting their quality of life.
I feel often that people with anxiety disorders watch their world get smaller and smaller, as the world seems, as more and more of the world seems dangerous and dangerous. That's the world gets smaller and smaller. And what we're really wanting to say to those people is that it's actually a wonderful world out there, and we want you sort of to be out and part of it. And that's what begins inhibiting people from having those relationships and being able to maintain a job, or to go to school, to sit in class, to be able to sit in class.
That's right.
Social phobia or social anxiety.
Right. Well, the name virtually says it all. It's a lot of anxiety about being around other people, and the thoughts that accompany that anxiety are often a sense of, I'm going to be judged negatively or critically or found wanting by the people around me. Those thoughts dominate, and we avoid being around other people. It can be, again, very disabling.
And how do people know the difference between sort of just being a shy person versus having something that we would say sort of reach the level of social anxiety or social phobia, Heather?
I would say, again, kind of looking at the thoughts, right? And, you know, what kinds of thoughts is the person having? Like, are they interacting with people and sort of engaging in what we call mind reading, where they're thinking that that person thinks that they're saying something silly, or that they're, you know, maybe not a good person, or it's all again about, I think, the perception and sort of what that person with social phobia oftentimes is thinking is that they're being criticized or judged in a negative way, you know, versus maybe just naturally being kind of a person who doesn't, you know, like a lot of social interactions.
And we are out of time. That's how fast it goes here. You know, some people tell me that they're afraid to be on television, so they won't come and be a guest on my show. And this is what I want to say to you people out there. There is nothing to be afraid of. You saw these two wonderful guests. They didn't seem afraid, did they? And nothing bad happened to them. Thanks so much for joining the discussion this week. And don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links, and read my blog, the place where I will answer more of your questions. And you can also email us your questions about next week's show, when we'll be talking about coping with traumatic life events like plane crashes. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching, and good night.